Why were so many women executed for witchcraft in England during the 17th century? So for much of history, particularly from the medieval period through to the 17th century and on into the 18th century, many people feared witchcraft and particularly witches. Witches were considered to be people who consorted with the devil and were therefore anti-Christian and were non-conformists, i.e. they were people who were in the community ready to destroy lives, crops, livelihoods, that kind of thing. Predominantly, witches were always perceived to be women. So in England alone, witch trials were conducted from the 15th century all the way to the 18th century, and it's estimated to have resulted in the death of about 500 people, 90% of which were women. So the type of women targeted by these witch hunts were older women, or they were women who were living on their own, they were unmarried, they were perhaps women who were involved with healing processes, things that people didn't completely understand, and as a result they were seen as not forming part of that tight-knit community, or they were used as scapegoats when things went wrong within that community. They were also sometimes women who were very poor, so they were sort of needing charitable help from the local parish and community, and so they were seen as a burden on the community, which people didn't like. And this became even more of an issue during the 17th century. Witch trials had always been taking place, but under the new king, so that's James I of England, James VI of Scotland, there seemed to be an increased rate in the amount of witch hunts, witch trials and executions. When James I came to the throne, there was already a Witchcraft Act in place, but he decided to relook at it and sharpen it, and he pushed it to the front of the political agenda at the time. These laws meant that anyone who was found guilty of witchcraft or sorcery that had ended in another person's death would they themselves be put to death. In England, the 17th century was seen as a time of great political upheaval and instability. We even had the English Civil War, which saw king and parliament fighting against each other. As a result, the country was torn apart, communities were basically destroyed, and everybody became very, very suspicious. People began to fear that the country was riddled with witches, and that is why their crops had failed, or that's why their neighbour had died, or why their child was sick. And so this man, Matthew Hopkins, called the Witchfinder General, came onto the scene in the middle of the 17th century, and he said, "I will find the witches and I will root them out so that we can have a peaceful nation once again." He was based mainly in East Anglia, so that's Cambridgeshire, Suffolk, Norfolk, the east of England. And so Matthew and his trusty assistant went from town to town in search of witches, and of course people came forward because they had a grudge against somebody or because they feared some woman down the road. Most of these women were vulnerable members of society. They were perhaps old, they were perhaps disabled, or they were perhaps outspoken and had spoken against somebody who didn't like it. But ultimately, they were unprotected by family or friends. So once these women were accused, they were then arrested, and then they were subjected to the most humiliating and torturous experience ever. Very often they would be stripped naked in front of a room full of men, and then their body would be searched for a witch's mark or a devil's mark. These marks could be anything. They could be a mole, or they could be an extra nipple, or literally anything. And women couldn't protect themselves against this. On top of this, most poor women had marks on their body from performing manual day-to-day labour, so even calluses and scars were taken into account as being a witch's mark or a devil's mark. Another way to apparently decide or find out whether a woman was a witch or not was strapping her to a ducking stool or a cucking stool. I've talked about this in another post, in which the woman was plunged into the water. If she floated to the top, she was a witch, and if she sunk and drowned, she wasn't a witch, but she was also dead. A variation of this was to tie the thumbs of the woman to her toes, dunk her in the water and see whether she floated or not. If she floated, she was a witch and had to be executed. If she drowned, of course, she was innocent, but she was also dead. And just look at the title of this pamphlet. It says, witches apprehended, examined and executed for notable villainies by them committed both by land and water. It then says underneath, with a strange and most true trial, how to know whether a woman be a witch or not. So this is a pamphlet for other people, other communities, to try and figure out whether a woman is a witch or not. Notably, it doesn't say if a man, it's always a woman. Women were also pricked with witches' needles or pricking needles during trials. So this is a depiction of a poor woman who's being accused of witchcraft. And this woman is pointing out one of her devil's marks. And one of the ways to try and get confession out of these women was to prick them with needles to see if it bled. If it bled, apparently that meant therefore that she was a witch. Honestly, there was no rhyme or reason to these trials. It was a witch hunt. The town or the community wanted these women to be found guilty, and so very often they were. And of course, during these trials, it was always hoped that these women, these witches, would confess. And so they were also flogged. They were also had the thumbscrews placed upon them, which of course made them want to confess to stop the pain. And then, of course, these poor women were executed. Many were hanged like this, but of course there are still examples of women being burnt at the stake. In East Anglia, where this villain was operating, it is thought that 112 women were executed for witchcraft in a 2-year period alone. And guess what? For every witch Matthew found, he was paid by the parish. It is often said that without Matthew Hopkins, most of those women would not have been accused or executed. So he really was a terrible man.